Podcast 2 of the Abdomen series, the peritoneum and peritoneal cavity. This podcast is going to detail the peritoneum and how it forms the peritoneal cavity. It will detail the numerous peritoneal ligaments, the ommenta, and various subdivisions. So the peritoneum is a double layer of serous membrane that lines the abdominopelvic cavity, and it invests the viscera that are contained within it. Like both the pleura and pericardium, the peritoneum is comprised of two continuous layers, the parietal and visceral layers. This means that the peritoneum, which lines certain organs, like the stomach or the spleen, is visceral peritoneum, whilst the peritoneum that is in contact with the abdominal wall is the parietal peritoneum. And just like the pleura and pericardium, these two layers of peritoneum form the peritoneal cavity, and this contains a thin film of serous fluid that allows the organs to slide against one another during digestion. The peritoneal fluid also contains some antibodies and white blood cells that help to combat infection. Although the peritoneal cavity is a completely closed membrane in the male, in the female, the peritoneal cavity is continuous with the outside world through the uterine tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. So the organs within the abdominal cavity have a varying relationship to the peritoneum, with organs being either retroperitoneal or intraperitoneal. Organs that are only partially covered by peritoneum, like the pancreas or the kidneys, are considered to be retroperitoneal, and this type of organ is usually found between the wall of the abdomen posteriorly and the parietal peritoneum anteriorly. Alternatively, if an organ is said to be intraperitoneal, like the stomach or parts of the ileum, then it will usually be associated with a mesentery and will be completely covered by visceral peritoneum. It is important to bear in mind that if an organ is said to be intraperitoneal, then it does not mean it is located within the peritoneal cavity, but it projects into the peritoneal cavity, just like the lungs that pushed into the pleural cavity but didn't actually enter it. The organs that are referred to as being intraperitoneal, like I said, the stomach or the ileum, are also extremely mobile, and this is due to the mesentery. So what exactly is a mesentery? Well, a mesentery is a double layer of peritoneum that has been reflected from the abdominal wall, and it extends to completely surround an organ. So if you remember that the walls of the abdominal cavity are lined by parietal peritoneum, then where this peritoneum is reflected from the abdominal wall to attach to a specific organ, this double layer of peritoneum is the mesentery. As this peritoneum completely surrounds the organ, this organ also becomes intraperitoneal, and with the aid of the mesentery becomes highly mobile. From this description, it should be clear that although the small intestines appears to be within the peritoneal cavity, it is actually located outside of this cavity, but it is suspended within it by this mesentery. Now, as I mentioned before, the mesentery is important in allowing certain abdominal organs to have an increased level of mobility, but it also provides a route for the neurovascular structures which leave the posterior abdominal wall to supply these organs. So the general term mesentery refers to any double layer of peritoneum that is associated with an organ that is invaginated into the peritoneum. Now the term the mesentery is usually associated with the jejunum and the ileum. Other organs like the transverse or sigmoid colon also have a mesentery, and this is then abbreviated to meso. So we have the transverse mesocolon or the sigmoid mesocolon. So as I mentioned previously, the stomach was an intraperitoneal organ, but this organ is not suspended in the peritoneal cavity by a mesentery, but by an omentum. An omentum is also a double-layered fold of peritoneum, but it specifically connects the stomach and first part of the duodenum to adjacent organs within the abdominal cavity. Within the abdomen, there are two ommenta, the lesser and greater. The lesser omentum is the simplest of the two and extends from the lesser curvature of the stomach and first part of the duodenum to the liver. And for descriptive purposes, the lesser omentum can be divided into two parts, depending on its attachment sites. There is the gastrohepatic ligament, which is the specific part of the lesser omentum that extends from the stomach to the liver. And then there is the hepatoduodenal ligament, which goes from the first part of the duodenum also to the liver. But remember that both of these peritoneal ligaments form the lesser omentum. The second omenta is the greater omentum, and this will usually be the first structure observed when the abdominal cavity is opened, as it drapes from the stomach like an apron. Specifically, the greater omentum extends inferiorly from the greater curvature of the stomach and also from the first part of the duodenum, and it lies over the coils of ileum. It then folds back on itself and extends superiorly and attaches to the transverse colon. Due to the greater omentum initially running inferiorly and then folding back on itself to run superiorly to the transverse colon, the greater omentum is made up of 4 layers, 2 from the descending layer and 2 from the ascending layer, and there is potential space located between these descending and ascending layers. This space is the omental bursa, which is also known as the lesser sac. So I want to spend some time detailing the lesser sac and how it is formed, as this often causes a great deal of confusion for some students. Now, within the peritoneal cavity, there is a greater sac and a lesser sac. The lesser sac is the smaller of the two, and it's located immediately posterior to the stomach and the lesser omentum. The greater sac makes up the majority of the peritoneal cavity and is anterior to the stomach. Now, in order to understand the boundaries of these two subdivisions, it is necessary to have an understanding of the embryology of the gastrointestinal organs. So initially, the foregut, midgut and hindgut are in contact with the posterior abdominal wall. But by the 5th week of development, the gut tube has migrated into the body cavity and is suspended by the dorsal mesentery. At the level of the stomach and first part of the duodenum, there is also a ventral mesentery, which connects these organs to the anterior abdominal wall. So importantly, the dorsal mesentery suspends the majority of the gut tube to the posterior abdominal wall, and the ventral mesentery connects the stomach and first part of the duodenum to the anterior abdominal wall. This arrangement means that at the level of the stomach and first part of the duodenum, these two mesenteries separate the developing body cavity into right and left sides. As development progresses, the ventral mesentery is going to form the liver and the lesser omentum, and also the falciform ligament. The dorsal mesentery is going to form the spleen and the greater omentum. So this leaves 2 questions. Firstly, how does the ventral mesentery form the lesser omentum? And secondly, how does the lesser sac become located behind the stomach? Well, the simple answer is rotation. Now, after the 4th week of development, the stomach rotates 90 degrees around its longitudinal axis in a clockwise direction, and this results in the ventral mesentery being positioned to the right of the stomach and the dorsal mesentery positioned to the left of the stomach. Now, it should become clear that as the liver develops in the ventral mesentery, the remaining pieces of peritoneum that extend from the stomach to the liver are going to form the lesser omentum, and then extending from the liver to the anterior abdominal wall is going to be the falciform ligament. So the lesser omentum is formed via the ventral mesentery. As the stomach rotates to the right, the liver develops in the ventral mesentery, and connecting the liver to the stomach is the lesser omentum, and connecting the liver to the anterior abdominal wall is the falciform ligament. This clockwise rotational movement of the stomach also has an effect on the 2 cavities that were positioned either side of the dorsal and ventral mesenteries. As the ventral mesentery migrated to the right, so the right cavity was forced posteriorly behind the stomach, and this cavity goes on to be the lesser sac. As the right cavity is forced posteriorly, so the left cavity is going to be forced anteriorly and ends up being positioned anterior to the stomach, and this cavity forms the greater sac. Now at the beginning of this process, these two cavities were roughly the same size, but due to the rotational movements and the considerable enlargement of the liver, the right cavity reduces in size and results in the lesser sac being considerably smaller than the greater sac. A further point I want to mention about these two sacs is that they are continuous with one another at the epiploic foramen, also known as the foramen of Winslow. This foramen is located at the free edge of the lesser omentum and is formed due to the ventral mesentery only being present at the level of the stomach and the first part of the duodenum. So if you follow the inferior border of the ventral mesentery, as the gut tube rotates and the lesser omentum is formed, this inferior border becomes the free edge of the lesser omentum, or more specifically, the hepatoduodenal ligament. In the cadaver, this foramen can be located by finding the stomach, the liver, and the lesser omentum. And at the right limit of the lesser omentum, you can pass your finger under its free edge. This is the foramen of Winslow, or the epiploic foramen, and your finger is passing from the greater sac into the lesser sac. With your finger in this foramen, then lying anteriorly is the hepatoduodenal ligament, which contains the portal triad of the hepatic artery, the portal vein, and the bile duct. Posteriorly is the inferior vena cava, superiorly is the caudate lobe of the liver, and inferiorly is the first part of the duodenum. So to complete the details regarding the lesser sac, we need to briefly consider its boundaries. The lesser sac is positioned directly behind the stomach and also extends inferiorly between the ascending and descending layers of the greater omentum. It is important to note that in the living person, this space is fused together and means the floor of the lesser sac is the transverse colon and its mesentery, the transverse mesocolon. Directly behind the lesser sac is the pancreas, and it is bound by the spleen to the left and by the liver to the right. Anteriorly is the stomach and the lesser omentum, and superiorly is the diaphragm. So to finish the details regarding the lesser and greater omenta, I want to mention a few peritoneal ligaments. Most prominent is the falciform ligament, which I mentioned earlier, but to remind you, this is the remainder of the ventral mesentery that passed from the liver to the anterior abdominal wall, and is important in conducting the umbilical vein from the placenta to the developing heart. In the living person, this vein is fibrosed and is known as the ligamentum teres. Previously, I mentioned that the gastrohepatic and hepatoduodenal ligaments are parts of the lesser omentum. Well, the greater omentum can also be divided into three parts, depending on its attachment sites. There is the gastrocolic ligament, which extends from the stomach to the transverse colon, and this ligament is synonymous with the greater omenta. There is the gastrophrenic ligament, which extends from the stomach to the diaphragm, and there is also the gastrosplenic ligament, which extends from the stomach to the spleen. This final ligament, the gastrosplenic ligament, is continuous towards the kidney as the lino or the splenorenal ligament, and this extends from the spleen to the right kidney and contains the tail of the pancreas. So to finish this podcast, I just want to detail two further subdivisions of the peritoneal cavity, and these are the supracolic and the infracolic compartments. These two compartments are both part of the greater sac and are separated by the transverse mesocolon. The supracolic compartment is superior to the transverse mesocolon and greater omentum and contains the stomach, liver, and spleen. The infracolic compartment is inferior to the transverse mesocolon and greater omentum and contains the jejunum, the ileum, and the ascending and descending parts of the colon. These two compartments, the supra and the infracolic compartments, are in communication via the paracolic gutters, which are the grooves form between the lateral aspect of the ascending or descending colon and the posterior abdominal wall, and these can conduct fluid from the infracolic to the supracolic compartments, or vice versa. So in this podcast, I've detailed the peritoneum and how it forms the peritoneal cavity, specifically detailing the lesser and greater omenta and the lesser and greater sacs. In the next podcast, number 3, I will detail the anatomy of the esophagus and stomach.